Our keynote tonight, Alan Mallach is a senior fellow at the Center for Community Progress in Washington, D.C., a city planner, advocate, and writer. He is nationally known for his work on housing, economic development, and urban revitalization. He's the author of A Decent Home, Planning, Building, and Preserving Affordable Housing, and Bringing Buildings Back from Vacant Properties to Community Assets. Tonight's program will begin with a discussion of Alan's book, The Divided City, Poverty and Prosperity in Urban America. So please join me in welcoming Alan Mallach.
And I want to talk tonight about, in a way, even though most of what I'm going to talk about is about other parts of the country and other cities, in a way it's really all about Seattle, because it's about the Seattle that could have been and then the Seattle that is. And if we go back, we start out, let's go way back. Let's see if I can make this work. Okay. If we go back to the 70s, and I suspect most of you are familiar with this particular image, the people had pretty much given up on the cities. And in fact, you may not be familiar with this, but towards the end of Jimmy Carter's term as president, when he was expecting a second term, which he didn't get, he created a blue ribbon committee on a national agenda for the 80s. I mean, these were the university presidents, corporate executives, brilliant thinkers, the best and the brightest. And they came out with a report, and they basically said that the United States should give up on its older cities, that they were hopeless, they were beyond repair, they were obsolete in an era of automobiles, and what the United States should do instead was to help the people who lived in those cities get the skills and ability to move to places that were growing, and so they could survive and thrive. Well, Carter, and that's what they wrote. Now, Carter didn't accept this, but the fact is, it reflected pretty widespread opinion that the cities were, in fact, obsolete and should pretty much be written off. Well, what happened more recently is things have changed in ways that people back in the 70s probably wouldn't have believed possible. The cities, places like Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis are bustling. There is new energy, there's new activity and investment, and it's driven basically by two things. The first thing is what happened to healthcare and higher education in this country. Back in 1950s, 1960s, when the cities were starting to decline, healthcare and higher education were hardly a blip in the national economy. Since then, they've skyrocketed. Here's one statistic I just find amazing. Since 1950, the U.S.'s population has roughly doubled. Over that same period, our spending on healthcare, after adjusting for inflation, has increased by 25 times. Now, what that meant for the cities is even though they were no longer particularly attractive to industry, they had, thanks to the legacy of the 19th and early 20th century, all of the infrastructure for healthcare and higher education. So basically, as you can see, eds and meds, as they're known, replaced manufacturing as the economic base in city after city. And that provided them with the base to move forward. The other thing that happened, though, was that young adults, but not any young adults with college degrees started moving to the cities at rates unprecedented in American history. And so places like Baltimore and St. Louis and Philadelphia now have twice the national average of people in 25 to 34 with BA or higher degrees. And these people, as you get these people and these jobs together, you start seeing consumption, you see restaurants, nightclubs, hotels, convention centers, entertainment centers, and the cities are growing from the impetus from that population, the impetus from the growth of education and healthcare and consumption. And it's transformed city after city. All of these are images from St. Louis, which, if you don't know it, is an incredibly exciting, vibrant city, which seems to be off the radar of most people on the two coasts, which is a pity. But These scenes are also from St. Louis. And they're not very far from the first set of slides. And what's happening in these cities, and what is so hard to accept, is that if you go back to the 70s, yes, neighborhoods were declining and poverty was increasing in the cities. But the cities were going down the tubes, so you'd expect it. Today, the cities are reviving, jobs are growing, people are moving in, investment is happening, and yet, even so, more neighborhoods are declining than thriving. Poverty is spreading and becoming worse. This is something I did a couple years ago. Indianapolis is generally thought of as a pretty prosperous city. And some people I knew who were involved in community development there asked me to take a look because their question was this. Everybody is talking about nothing except gentrification in Indianapolis, but we think it's a more complicated picture. Could you crunch some numbers and come tell us what you find? Okay. I like crunching numbers. I like the sound of numbers crunching underfoot as I walk. So I came up with a simple measure of gentrification, which meant such and such an increase in house prices plus such and such an increase in incomes. And then so the first map was what I found. 6 census tracts out of about 200 in Indianapolis were clearly gentrifying. And then I flipped the numbers, said how many census tracts are declining at the same rate that those 6 census tracts are rising? Well, you can see the second map. 60. 10 census tracts were losing value, losing income for every one that was gaining. And this is Atlanta, another city which is thought of, I think rightly, as a growing, prosperous city. The areas in purple are the areas that were high poverty, segregated, majority African American neighborhoods in 2000. The areas in the red outline are the areas that were not in 2000 but are today. As you can see, there are an awful lot of them. And the poverty and segregation has spread out of the central city into the entire range of Atlanta's suburban counties. Another piece, if you go back to 1950, 1960, most neighborhoods in most American cities, including Seattle, were what some people call middle neighborhoods. They weren't particularly poor, they weren't particularly rich. They were where working class and middle class people lived, and their incomes were pretty much in the range of the city average. And there were still a fair number of them 15, 20 years ago. But if you look at St. Louis in 2000, there are still quite a lot, but by 2015, they had almost entirely disappeared. Almost every neighborhood in St. Louis had either become poor or rich, little in between. And the other thing is that during the same period, the disparity between the incomes of white people and African Americans grew wider, which during the 90s, it actually narrowed, not by a huge amount, but significantly. But then it widened into a chasm. And remember this slide, because I'm going to come back to it when I start talking about Seattle. So this is why I called my book The Divided City, because it's about how we have two cities. We have a city that is thriving and growing and reviving at an unprecedented level, but a city, and in most cases a much larger city, that is not only declining, but in many respects falling off an economic cliff. And this is, I think, the fundamental urban challenge of our times. Well, what about Seattle? Now, if you go back to the 1970s, Seattle was not much different from any of the cities I've just been talking about. It was a mid-sized, primarily industrial manufacturing city. Okay, it had mountains and water, so it was a much more beautiful setting than Philadelphia or Baltimore or Cleveland can claim. But that doesn't pay the bills. It was basically a working class, middle class city that was struggling, especially during the years when Boeing started to look really shaky. And in fact, in 1950, family incomes in Seattle were not much higher than in Milwaukee or Chicago, and housing costs were actually lower. Seattle, just think about it. In 1970, Seattle was a significantly more affordable city than either Milwaukee or Chicago. Something changed. Now, Seattle lost population in the 70s, and Seattle was on a track that didn't look that different from, let's say, Baltimore or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. And then it turned around, and it started to grow back. And it's growing back at a faster and faster pace. Since 2010, Seattle has added 15,000 people each year. And you ask, why are there traffic jams? Now and remember, this is a city that from a classic planning standpoint, people would have said way back that it was a fully developed city. And somehow it is squeezing in 15,000 people a year. It's grown by 120,000 people since 2010 without changing its boundaries, without spreading out. And this is a function of job growth. Seattle has about the same population as Baltimore or Detroit. It's got like 75% more jobs than Baltimore and more than double the number of jobs of Detroit. And it's been growing jobs rapidly. And it's unlike cities like Detroit and Cleveland and Baltimore, which are so heavily dependent on the eds and meds sector, Seattle has been growing. Now, Seattle has a very strong eds and meds sector, and it represents about 20% of the jobs in the city. But if you go to Baltimore, it represents almost 40% of the jobs in that city. Seattle has, as everybody knows, strong tech industry, information systems, but also because of the high salaries and the affluence of the people who are coming into what you might call Seattle's primary industries. Seattle has also grown extraordinarily in terms of consumption, food, hotels, entertainment, conventions, and so forth. So Seattle is basically, from an economic standpoint, firing on all cylinders. And it is drawing an extraordinary number of well-educated young people. If you go back, you saw the slide that showed St. Louis and Baltimore. Seattle has twice as many people 25 to 34 with BA or higher degrees than any of the cities like St. Louis or Baltimore that are growing with that population. There's 1 out of every 5 people in the city of St. Louis is a young person, 25 to 34-year-old, with a college degree, which is roughly almost 4 times the national average. And of course, going back, of course, these people are making good money. You see from the slide, according to this I found recently in GeekWire, the average tech worker in Seattle makes $132,000. Now, when you bear in mind the average family income in the United States is about $60-something thousand. That is good money, and that supports a lot of lattes, as well as $3,000 a month apartments, etc. So, as a result, house prices are going up. When you are crowding more and more people with a lot of money into what is basically the same space, you are creating incredible pressure on anything that is a finite resource. And housing is a finite resource. And one thing also about this, and that's why I asked you to look at here, I've added Seattle to the chart I showed you before. if you look at the growth in racial inequality, Seattle, it's more so in terms of the growing disparity between white and African American households, more than any of the other cities I talked about, like Baltimore or Philadelphia or St. Louis. Since 2000, white incomes have grown by 80%, black incomes by about 15%. And neighborhood change, in 2000, there were still a lot of neighborhoods in Seattle that were not affluent, in this case defined as above the national median. Today, there are hardly any. The city, affluence is spreading throughout the city. But what it means is that it's become more and more difficult for the people who are not affluent to live here. If you go back to 2000, as you can see, the first two groups here, this is basically the people who are poor or near poor. And they were mostly housing burdened in 2000, and they are still equally housing cost burdened. In other words, they can't find housing that they can afford. But that's true pretty much everywhere in the country. If you're poor, you can't find housing you can afford, whether you live in Seattle or Schenectady or Skaneateles or New Orleans or Mobile, Alabama, because the American real estate industry, for reasons that I could explain to you but don't have time, is systemically designed to make it impossible for poor people to find housing they can afford. But now it's changed. You look at how the percent of people with cost burden. In 2000, very few people earning more than $35,000 had a cost burden. Today, the great majority do, almost all of them. So this means two things. First, you have a huge pool of people who would be considered middle-income people pretty much anywhere else, who find it difficult, if not impossible, to afford housing in the city of Seattle. If you have an income of less than about $60,000 a year, you're going to have trouble finding housing you can afford in Seattle. The second thing, what it means is as things get worse and worse, people in this group start falling off the edge. And instead of being housed, but at a cost burden, they become unhoused and become homeless or doubling up or move out of the city. But one way or another, they fall off the charts as far as the city is concerned. So you're going to have more and more of that. And that, in some respects, is why the homeless problem is so difficult to tackle. And it's not because people move to Seattle to become homeless. Given the climate, that strikes me as being pretty fundamentally implausible. But it's about the fact that as prices get higher and the bottom of the housing market keeps moving up and up and up and up, more people who used to be housed, although with difficulty, are falling off and falling into the ranks of the homeless. And as long as the process that's been going on for the last decade or so continues, that is going to continue. And the other point is that, Seattle is exporting the challenge to its suburbs, particularly the South King County suburbs. And this shows, I've highlighted the income groups which have shown disproportionate growth in 3 cities in South King County. In Tukwila, the number of people earning below $15,000, which is pretty low, has more than doubled. In Federal Way, the number of people earning $15 to $25,000 has more than doubled. In Auburn, the number of people earning anything up to about $35,000, even though it hasn't doubled, has increased by 40% or more. So today, the problem, and this is where I think I'll tie it up, is the problem is no longer a divided city, it's a divided region. The problem is a regional one, and a solution, if it's going to be found, is likely to have to be a regional one as well. But either way, Seattle has become a city of almost mind-boggling prosperity. But bear in mind, Seattle could have gone along a very different path and could have been a city much more like Baltimore or St. Louis today, a city of prosperity and poverty. But Seattle has gone more for, I think, just pure luck than anything else, down a different path, and is facing a very different challenge. The challenge of how to become a city for everyone when the pressures are to make it a city for fewer and fewer and fewer people. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mallach, for teeing us up rather well there. I thought your points were well chosen and right on target. For our fellow panelists, let's ease into this a little bit. Let's start with something soft. What reactions do you have to Mr. Mallach's presentation, and anything that stood out or resonated with you that relates to what he shared, especially about King County and what you're dealing with as you try to lead us through this challenge? And we'll start with you, Mayor Durkan.
So I think two things that jumped right out is the call to regional solutions, which with these women up here, we've been trying to kind of change and reconfigure how we attack these problems. And the second is, I have to tell you, every time I see those graphs, it's still shocking. The number of people who, the population increases, but the influx of wealth and jobs and the number of people being left behind. You know, I see it every day as mayor, as I'm in different neighborhoods talking to people. You see it with the homeless on the street. You see it with housing costs, with gentrification and displacement. But seeing the graphs every time it is still such a jarring amount.
Yeah, thank you. Mayor Backus.
So first, I would say I like to crunch numbers too. But the statistics are staggering, and as Mayor Durkan said, we see this on a daily basis, but the approach that we've all been trying to take up here is to work on this regionally. And I've said it numerous times, we know that what works in Seattle may not work in Auburn, may not work in Bellevue, but if we're not having these discussions together, we're never going to find those solutions. And so I'm really proud of the work that we get to do regionally to try and solve those issues. We know that for every $100 that rent is increased in Seattle, it can increase homelessness by up to 10%. But when you get out in South King County, for every $100 that rent is raised, it can be anywhere from 35 to 40+%. And that's because we kind of become the last hope. Rents are still affordable in South King County, affordable. They're still staggering, but they're still affordable. And when you can't afford the rent in Auburn, where do you go? You're out on the streets in many cases.
Well, thank you. And most people may not realize, but in terms of rent growth, the increases have been most significant in South King County in the last few years. So, yes. Councilmember Balducci.
Yeah, I was really taken in the presentation by the history and sort of the trends, that one slide that showed the comparison between wages and housing costs in the 70s and 80s. Because one of the things, and you said to slide in a little bit, I'm not coming with all the statistics right in the first question, but one of the things we talk about when we do housing work is I like to share our personal housing stories because it helps to paint the picture. So I live in Bellevue. People think of Bellevue as being very unaffordable, but when I came to Bellevue with my boyfriend, now husband, in the 90s, we were able to buy a small house in East Bellevue in the mid-1990s with $8,000 down. That was by cashing in some Boeing stock that he had gotten as a baby, I think, and on my income. And we were able to afford that house, which will shortly be worth $1 million, right? And we haven't scraped it and built a new. It's still a small house in East Bellevue. So where's the opportunity for the next young couple? Where's the opportunity for people coming out of school now who may have good jobs and may have good wages, absolutely could not have that path to home ownership and stability that was pretty easy for us in retrospect. Didn't feel like it at the time. And so I think when I see that, there's systemic problems and systemic challenges that are just not that easy to address.
You know, Marty, let me just raise one more thing too. I think the other slide that we've got to keep front and center as we talk is a slide on the disparate impacts by race.
Yeah.
And you see it, the indicators show up, and everything that shows the indication of, I think, disparities in a city, whether it's the criminal justice system, the homeless population. And we know that communities of color are not keeping up, particularly African Americans. And if we don't deal with that, with racism in America, if we don't hit systemic racism and have some first honesty about it, those numbers will continue to increase. And I think we've got to keep front and center that that's an obligation.
Thank you for taking us to the actual next question. Because in our region, there's this growing concern really about equitable development and growth, specifically regarding people of color and how we have seen most of the displacement really affect people of color, with them being swept out of some of the long-standing and established neighborhoods. And the displacement is not just physical, but it's both economic and cultural. And my question to you is, does this resonate with your leadership experience? And what strategies do you think local governments can employ to actually get ahead of this challenge?
So I will say that it most definitely resonates. I doubt that there's a single community, not just in King County, but in any portion of our state where this doesn't resonate in some way, shape, or form. We have a very diverse county. Kent, we sometimes call North Auburn. It has one of the most diverse school districts, the greatest number of languages spoken in the school district in the nation. Tukwila and Kent are two of those cities, and we can no longer pretend that these issues don't exist. And so it's how do we work with the schools? How do we work with regional government? Again, we work together on these issues because while we have some things that are not similar, a lot of the issues are very similar. We may have to take a little bit of a different approach for the resolution, but the issues are very similar. And in our community, we have a very large Hispanic community. We have a very large Native American community because we are co-located with the Muckleshoot Indian tribe. And so along with that comes challenges of how do we serve? When I speak with the tribal chair, I go, our issues are not that different, and we're serving the same people. Because a good number of the Muckleshoot tribal members don't live on reservation property, which, by the way, is kind of an odd shape right within the center of the city of Auburn. And so what do we do to work together for the betterment? We have organizations that we work with, communities or cities and schools, where the Muckleshoot tribe is invited to be a member of this, to where we are working on the issues of significance for not just the cities, but for the school, for Green River College, and for the Muckleshoot tribe. And how do we best pool our resources? There are things that we as a city are going to be able to do well and easily that the tribe might not be able to, and vice versa. So we have to leverage those strengths. We have to find the ways that we can work together and leverage what we can do for the greater impact.
I want to echo something Mayor Durkan said. King County has done a lot of work looking at indicators of health and indicators of success at the community level, and it is absolutely true that in every category you can imagine, health, economic mobility, transportation access, all the things that you mentioned, criminal justice, communities of color and individuals of color fare worse. And it's by geography as well as race, because those communities as a whole have been very heavily impacted by historic decisions, but also when we try to do something right, when we try to help, when we provide subsidized housing, when we provide a regional transportation system that we've been working so hard to build out, it almost always disproportionately benefits the majority community and the majority whites and Asians and not African Americans and other, disadvantaged communities, immigrants. We see whole communities essentially being pushed geographically further and further away from job centers, from education centers, because of cost. And that's market forces at work. I will say that on the Regional Affordable Housing Task Force that we have convened at King County, that we're working with cities on, we have representatives from Seattle and suburban cities. We're getting close to final recommendations, and we've come up with 8 actually now goals, and one of them is around displacement. We have a specific goal around displacement because we need to be intentional about helping communities to help themselves. Part of equitable development, part of making sure that people have places to live and that their communities are supportive, is letting the communities lead, letting them identify their needs and helping support them to fulfill their needs, which is not something government is often great at. We're really good at, hey, I've got a solution and here we're gonna do it. But we don't know what we don't know sometimes, and the communities really do know what they need. So we're working in this direction, but I think we have a ways to go, quite honestly.
If I could just add one thing, there was...
We're actually going to have audience questions in just a little bit. If you could go ahead and write that down, we'll take it. But.
So in 2015, there was a study that was completed by Seattle King County Public Health, and it showed the map, not based on if you're red or blue based on your political beliefs, but red and blue based on blue being really, really good and red being really, really bad. South King County was deeply red, and that even included a life expectancy that was 10 years less than on the east side and on the north side. And so we started a blue ribbon panel in our city to make Auburn the healthiest city in Washington by 2020. It's a really lofty goal, but if we don't start, we'll never get there. And so we've focused on opioids and diabetes and healthy weights and working on immunizations in the schools, things that really make a difference to the health, to the mobility of the people in our cities.
So I think, I know we're going to get the next question. I think a couple things picking up on this is, if we are serious about this, we have to be intentional. We have to be intentional, and our default has to be towards action. Because if we just let things continue, then there'll be further displacement, further inequities. And so as a city of Seattle, we've looked at this and say, what is equitable development? Number one thing we have to remember is we have to have community-based solutions. The very communities who are being displaced have the solutions, and we must empower them. And so in Seattle, what we've tried to do is we don't have enough, but we have an equitable development fund that actually first does capacity building, so organizations have the ability to grow and to do what they need to do. But second, to invest in things that wouldn't happen otherwise, that the Filipino Community Center, the Ethiopian Community Center, Africa Town, those communities that are just trying to keep their toehold where they are. And you see what happens, particularly in immigrant and refugee communities. If the elders can stay here, often their children and their grandchildren can't because it's too inexpensive. And so then you're splitting them culturally as well. And so to build like El Centro de la Raza did, where you have plaza, community gathering spaces, and housing above. So we have to be super intentional about turning to community itself to say, what are the solutions? How do we empower you to get there? Rather than us trying to think we know how to solve it from City Hall.
We're the government, we're here to help.
Wow. So our next question just goes back to this regional approach, and this is a question for you, Councilmember Balducci. You are leading a regional affordable housing strategy in King County, and what are you discovering mostly on the magnitude of the need, and what are some of the potential new strategies that you are sort of coming up with in that process for us to be able to address the affordable housing crisis?
Yeah, so at the task force, one of the first things we did was we went to look for what would it take in terms of new housing, preserved housing, to have a healthy housing market. What would that look like? What would it be? And so the definition that we came up with was if we could eliminate cost burden for anybody earning 80% of the area median income or below. So for a family of 4 around here these days, I think that's about $50,000. So cost burden means you're spending 30% or more of your income on housing, means you're at risk of potentially not being able to pay for housing. And we did a pretty in-depth analysis, and what we came up with was, if growth stopped today, we would need 156,000 housing units in King County that we don't have today. Our housing has not kept up with our growth in this county. Of course, growth, and by the way, that's a 2017 number, so it's actually if growth stopped last year, which we know that it did not. If growth continues on the trajectory that we have projected at the Regional Council and other places, we would need, by 2040, 250,000 units plus. So we just really need to scale up our ability to provide housing. So we've talked about a number of different ways to do this. To the question of how long does it take, let me just tell you, when I heard that, I was like, it makes my stomach clench every time I hear that question, because there's a lot of things we're doing now. There are things we need to do faster, but honestly, with a scale of that size, you don't get into a hole that deep overnight, and you don't get out of a hole that deep overnight. We will need to do a wide range of things. We will need to provide a lot more subsidized housing than we provide today. At the lower levels of affordability, people on the 30% of area median income, 50% of area median income, the market's not going to provide housing that those people can afford, not our market. And so we need to find ways to raise more money to build more housing that people can afford, that's subsidized by the government. We also need to free up the market to do more, because the market's providing tons of high-end housing. We're producing tons of units, but all of it is very, very high-end. So how can we break free the power of the market to do what the market can and should do? To build that little stick-built house that I bought in the mid-1990s, I don't need the government to build that house. So can we, as a region, adopt policies, land use policies, funding policies that will enable this kind of growth to not go, like, I've been to more ribbon cuttings than I can even remember, and they're great, every single one of them. 60 new units, 20 new units, 100 new units. We're planning lots of affordable housing around transit. It's never going to add up to 156,000 units. So we need to allow the market to do what it does. We talk about ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and I know Seattle's doing a lot of work in this area, but in Bellevue, we don't allow detached accessory dwelling units. I've got a pretty big lot with a pretty small house. I could build another small house on that lot, and somebody could live there. And if I'm a senior, if my costs are high because since I bought my house, it's become very expensive, so my property taxes are high, I could make some money and stay in my house this way. And now we've got 2 people living in a place where 1 person lived before. Yeah. Lots of policy things like that. I could go on. I'll stop.
So I have a quick follow-up question on the land use and producing more housing, and looking at just across King County and the differences in the jurisdictions and the attitudes towards whether it's new housing or preservation. How can we get to that goal, having all of the jurisdictions on board? Because I think you will hear as you go throughout that there are certain cities where the feeling is we have enough housing that has been produced and we don't want to produce more.
That is an excellent question. We have 39 cities in King County. We're doing our best to work together to bring as many of the cities together to work on as much of this as we can. But really, individual places have different challenges, and I'm going to defer to Mayor Backus in a moment here, because there are places where, like in East Bellevue, 10, 15, 20 years ago, the housing stock was there. It was affordable. It could have remained affordable if we had taken action back then, but we didn't. So now it's not affordable, and now we're talking about needing new housing. So the horse is out of the barn in those places. There are places in the county where the idea of making sure that housing stock remains habitable, healthy, humane is necessary, and then the housing can continue to be affordable to people. Marty, you referred to this as the hole in the bucket?
Yes.
Yeah, there's a hole in the bucket. So we're trying to fill it, but the water keeps draining out. So when certain cities say, we just need to preserve our housing, they're not wrong. They do need to preserve the housing, or else the problem just gets bigger while we're trying to solve it. So I think different strategies can work in different places. We want to maximize our joint efforts, but we also need to let different cities, based on the knowledge of their local conditions, do what they can for their housing market.
Thank you for that. You know, you may have heard me talk about this as a wicked problem from a scientific standpoint, the complexity of it. And for Mayors Durkan and Backus, we hear a lot of discussion about the challenges of growth and a lot of blame, or where do we place the blame for what has happened. I think it's interesting in the context of what Mr. Mallach presented in terms of where Seattle could have gone. But how do we get past the finger pointing that's taking place and create that regional gel that moves us away from the divided region and helps us find ways to marshal the resources? And we know the federal government situation. We know that the lack of resources or the cutback of resources there is a big part of our challenge. We know that we have a state that's the most regressive in the country in terms of its tax revenue structure. We've advanced from 48th to I think 35th on mental health in the nation, so a little progress. But what do you're both leading in a very difficult environment. What can you latch on to that says we can unite? How can we move forward on this?
I latch on to her.
We latch onto each other. Look, I think the point about regional solutions is absolutely right, but it's not just regional, it's statewide too. And if we don't have solutions that go across borders, we won't have solutions. Because the problem of homelessness, for example, it doesn't stop in Seattle, it doesn't stop in Auburn. If you look at poverty and racism, it doesn't stop at borders. And we have to, I think, take deep looks inside, find the common goals and objectives, and then it's going to take political will. You know, if I had a magic wand, we have to do things like you're talking about. Number one, if we really want this region to be the region of the future where we don't have the disparities that we saw, we need a housing investment on the scale that we did Sound Transit 3. We have to say, this is important to us, it matters, and we're going to do it.
Bravo.
We have to then look at we always talk about a regressive tax system. Change it. We have to find a way to change it. Not overnight, maybe, but one at a time.
Here,
and
here.
it is
We're
time
with
to
you.
do it.
Yeah.
And if
Can I hear some clapping?
And that means sometimes going to be giving things up and doing, be honest about it. So if you tell people we're not just going to do an income tax or we're not just going to do a capital gains tax, we really are going to reduce the regressive taxes of sales tax and property tax. We really are going to provide real schooling and a college education free for every kid. If we start putting behind what we say our values are, then we can change it. But if all we do is just every day come together on things like this and wring our hands and wonder, we know what we have to do. We just have to do it.
I think part of that.
Bravo, thank you.
Part of that has to do with building trust. I've said numerous times, I don't think most people care what level of government we're in. We are all lumped together as government, and the majority of government fails. I mean, we will raise taxes, we will tell you that we're here to do the very best for you, but if we don't provide results, why should you trust us? Maybe we can't start as big as we would like to get these things done, but we've got to start somewhere to prove to you what we say we're going to do is what we're going to do. Now, Mayor Durkan and I were in Los Angeles last week. We met with Mayor Garcetti, Executive Constantine went with us, and we were talking about homelessness and what are they doing in LA and LA County. Now, we have 39 cities in King County. LA has 88 cities. Imagine trying to work 88 cities in a county. But they came together and said, we need to be held accountable. And it was the people that actually decided that they wanted a ballot measure. This is a 10-year ballot measure, and believe me, I am not advocating for this right now because we have to prove that the money that we have right now is being used the right way. But LA went with $3.5 billion. That's a B, over 10 years. So $350 million every year to fight homelessness in their county. And I think they said in the 2 years it's reduced it by 4%. 4%. Now, if we were in school, that would not be a passing grade. But at least it's something. But what they were talking about there as well is accountability. And they had a challenge for the city, and they have 12 council members on their city council. Every council member made a commitment to 222 new units of affordable housing within their district. And there was a scorecard up on the webpage that showed how many units had been built in each council member's district. And there were at least 3 of them on there that had, in the last 2 years, built 0 of the 222 units that each one of their districts had committed to. 0. Some were over the 222, but we have got to start holding people accountable. And that's what you do on election day, right? If you don't like that we're not holding to what we tell you we're going to do, if you think we're just giving you lip service because that's what we think you want to hear, then get rid of us, right? I mean, I love my job, but if I'm not doing what I promise I'm going to be doing, get rid of me and find somebody that'll do it. But that's what our goal is to make sure that we're not just providing you with lip service, that we are out there on a daily basis looking at what are the different options, and we're not assuming that sitting at City Hall, we have all of the answers. If we did that, we are a huge failure. But it's going out in the community and it's listening, as Mayor Durkan said, and as Councilmember Balducci said, listening to the people that are living these situations. That's where we have to start. And we have to quit saying we will work on it and say we are working on it.
Super. Thank you. So, Patience, I think you should ask one more question, but then we're going to be collecting the cards from the audience now, and we'll start bringing those up here, and we'll bring Mr. Mallach up after this last question, and we'll have a Q&A time from the audience. Patience, do you have one more question?
Yes. So, and thank you for just talking a little bit more about your commitment around this. We hear about the suburbanization of poverty, and I think Mallach in his presentation really showed how, if you look at cities like Tequila, you have heard a doubling of the people that are earning $15,000 and below, and looking at Federal Way, it's sort of a similar trend. And there's a challenge of limited resources in those suburban cities. And Elizabeth Nibon, in her book, Confronting Suburban Poverty, really goes into the detail of looking at the jurisdictional fragmentation challenge. In your opinion, what could potentially help these cities get beyond these crises, maybe through sub-regional efforts? What would that look like? And at regional level, what would that look like? And this is a question for you to Mayor Backus.
So Auburn is unique in the fact that we are split between 2 counties. A little over 70,000 of our population is in King County, and a little over 10,000 is in Pierce County. And I sat in a meeting of mayors for Pierce County almost 2 weeks ago, talking about housing affordability. And we think every time you move south, housing gets more affordable. But when you have the mayors of DuPont and University Place and Tacoma and Puyallup all worrying about housing affordability as well, you know the problem is spreading. And I found it really interesting because we have these mature conversations about housing affordability in King County, but those discussions are in their infancy in Pierce County. And so there are some jurisdictional, it's fractured. And so it's getting everyone up to speed. It's making sure that there are commitments from everyone involved. And I will tell you, in South King County and in North Pierce County, not every city believes they have a problem. That's sad, but it's true. And so we're out there on the bandwagon trying to make sure everyone knows, yes, there is a problem. Yes, there is a problem in your city or your jurisdiction. And yes, you need to be part of the solution. So we don't have everyone on board yet, but we do a road show and we'll get as many of them as we can. But it's working across cities People that are experiencing homelessness don't care if they're sleeping on the street in Auburn or in Kent. They don't know where that boundary line is. They just know that something needs to be done, and we need to make sure that we're providing those services. And it takes money, I'm not going to lie. It takes money, something that we don't have a lot of, and a lot of cities are finding structural deficits right now because the revenue is not going up at the same rate as expenses. Property taxes are not any of our favorite topics, but property taxes are capped at 1% growth per year for a city, plus new development. Do you think salaries and construction costs and everything else that we have to pay for rises at 1%? It does not. And I know you have huge property taxes already, so I'm not going to sit here and say, raise your hand if you want your property taxes raised. But I'm just telling you that those are some of the challenges that cities are facing right now, is how do we find the revenue to do the things that we know that we need to do and preserve the housing stock that we have in South King County that's been there for years and needs to be preserved, and build new housing in other areas.
And I'm going to just give a plug on, we're talking about, the place in the track where things have not worked well. We need housing, we have poverty. And one thing we have to do as society, as governments, as cities, is what are we making sure that more people aren't entering poverty and really taking those things we can do and we know that work. For example, on the ballot, if you're voting this year, the Families and Education Levy, which will almost double the number of preschool slots, mostly for disadvantaged families. And we know for a fact that if you give good quality preschool education and kids show up ready to learn, they do better. And if they do better in life. But so many families don't have that, particularly families of color and disadvantaged family. And then if we get them through high school and close the opportunity gap, if we give them 2 years free college, we will be opening doors. And that is one of the quickest ways we can make sure that this growing disparity stops, is to give real opportunity, not fake opportunity, real opportunity to our youth.
I feel like I'm going to end on a downer note here, and I apologize for
that.
Don't do it.
Okay, stop. We're going to take a question now.
I want to say that a lot of the work we're doing is about building political will, and that means building will within the leadership of the jurisdictions where we're at to do some of these things that need doing, to raise the money that's needed to be raised, to make the land use changes that need to be made, to reverse these trends in housing costs. There's a reason the political will needs to be generated, and it's not just because we're all too busy or tired or scared to do something. It's because in a lot of places, in a lot of those 39 cities, some of the ones I represent, the community, significant members of the community, more of them than of some of those folks who I imagine are here tonight, are telling us we don't want any of that. I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to upzone my neighborhood. It's going to change the character of my life. It's going to change the investment that I bought into. Why are you taking away from me to give to somebody else? And so we need the community and the government to work together to find a way to make room for the next generation, to make room for the people who need places. And it's just not as easy as, giving a rousing speech and having people all just come along. It's a lot easier to get people to come out to a city hall meeting or a county council meeting to say no than it is to get them to say yes. And I want to give a shout out to some of the organizers, because there are organizers in this community and in my community who spend a lot of their time getting people to know what's going on, publicizing the meeting, saying, come out and say yes in my backyard, not no in my backyard. And they are absolutely gold, because we need people, because we know you're out there. We know that the majority of folks probably want to do the right thing, but we hear from the folks who are scared and want us to just sort of, maybe not in my neighborhood though, maybe someplace else, or maybe don't raise my taxes anymore because McCleary hit me so hard, those property taxes for education. Light rail hit me so hard. We have to work on figuring out a vision, sharing it with everybody, building support in the community together for that vision, and then doing the hard things it takes. But I think we'd be giving you a wrong sense if we didn't share some of the challenges that stand in the way of that.
Yeah, and taking
That wasn't that negative.
Yeah, taking us right into the yes in my backyard. There's a question specifically for Mayor Durkan. Two-thirds of Seattle's residential land is exclusively zoned for single-family homes, making new housing effectively illegal. How can we reconcile this fact with our values of an equitable and inclusive city?
It's a great question. So 2 parts to that question. First is, unfortunately, we have less land than we think. If we take out all the parks and the streets and all of that, about 33% of Seattle is actually zoned residential, single family. But there's 2 things we know we can do immediately. Number 1 is, we're being appealed again, but we want to give every single family owner the ability to have a mother-in-law and a backyard cottage. We can turn every single family lot into a triplex. And it's scalable, it's doable, it's by choice, you can stay in your lot. We also know there's areas that have to be upzoned, and you can retain, and if you look in the urban villages. And then the other thing we have to do is we are investing billions of dollars in transit. And I want to, one of the things that we did on the board is every transit stop, we are going to do transit-oriented development that makes sure it has affordable housing right by transit. And that will make more equity.
Very good. That's a great answer. So the next question is about incomes. When people who work full-time only earn 30% area median income, they require deep housing subsidies. What's your plan to reduce the gap between wages and housing prices?
I mean, I am the worst person to speak about this because at King County we have no say over wages whatsoever. We could actually actually that's not true. We could pass a minimum wage legislation like the city of Seattle did. It would apply in unincorporated King County, so it wouldn't help the disparity very much because you'd be pretty far away from most jobs. I mean, maybe some of the urban centers. I think this gets back to the point about different levels of government are necessary to really deal with all of the challenges we have. The federal government has a role. The state government has a role. Labor standards have lagged behind. Labor wages, hours, and working conditions have lagged behind statewide, nationally. And so as costs go up, it goes back to that slide that we were talking about, historically where the wages were versus the housing costs, and the gap has just widened tremendously. There's not a ton that a local government other than Seattle really can do, to tell you the truth, about wages. We can provide opportunity. We can provide transportation. There's been some pretty good longitudinal studies showing that the #1 factor that helps families rise out of poverty, climb up the economic ladder, and get better wages is access to convenient, frequent, reliable transportation. That it just gives people access to jobs. And so when you do that, people can climb themselves up out of poverty. It was an interesting finding. We expected it to be education or something more traditionally associated with success. But so building that light rail system is really important. Making sure we put housing that people can afford near the light rail system so it doesn't just drive people further away is important.
And there's another thing, and I would say, everyone's got to do their own thing, but when you talk about transit, so we gave every Seattle public school student a free transit pass this year. And it is opening doors that I never anticipated. I was doing a roundtable with youth in Lake City Way and talking to them on what this. And this one kid was talking about his best friend who wanted to do Running Start. Bored in high school, wanted to do Running Start, but literally physically could not get to the college campus because he couldn't afford it. He got his free Orca pass, and that kid's in college now.
That's great.
And so we have to look systemically through everything government can do, but mostly housing, housing, housing. We need not just deeply affordable housing, but we also need in Seattle workforce housing. Because people who work in Seattle, most of them can't afford to live in Seattle. Our teachers, our firefighters, our service workers, the people who work, for example, on Capitol Hill and the bars. The people that earn the less commute the farthest because they can't afford to live in Seattle. We got to have really intentional ways to change that, because if we don't, we lose the soul of our city.
One of the things too that we're doing in Auburn, I mentioned cities and schools earlier. So Auburn, Algona, Pacific, Green River College, and the Auburn School District. We decided to work on a jobs initiative. Now, this is probably blasphemous being on the Seattle University campus, but we realize that not everybody is 4-year or advanced degree bound. but that doesn't mean that you can't make a family wage income. And so that could mean the trades, that could be apprenticeships. We know that everyone needs post-secondary education, but it doesn't have to be a 4-year degree. I mean, I think years ago we pushed everybody to have that 4-year degree, so we've got all these wonderful engineers designing things and absolutely no one to build them. We have a shortage of people in the trades to be able to do the work that we need to have done. Sound transit, housing. We don't have the trades available. So we're working with the schools. We have some champions within our community and in the businesses. We have the trades involved that are going to help us build those family wage jobs so that people in the city of Auburn, students who are graduating, don't have to leave their community to find a good paying job. And so it's not just any one level, but we know that with a little bit of post-secondary education, there is a better opportunity, a better chance for them to survive and to be able to find housing that isn't greater than that 30% of your income, and that they can stay in a community that they know, that they're familiar with, and they don't have to move further away because it's not affordable for them to live there.
Can I throw one more thing in here? Now we're going to move on. In this, so we've seen these slides on disparity. We, in my opinion, are living in a time that is more displacing than the Industrial Revolution. And with the pace of new technology and automation, we are going to see far greater displacement if we don't have these intentional strategies. I did my first trip into an Amazon Go store this week. I've been fighting it. It's transformative. And as I said to my friends in the grocery clerk union, the battle is not, are they going to be unionized? The battle is whether there's any human working there. And we're seeing that across sectors. So if we in government don't have policies to match up, we can't just say it's cool to get it. What are we going to do with the displaced workers? That's it's not a rhetorical question. If we don't have a plan, they're going to be in that graph of the people who suddenly fall off the charts because they have no job, no home. So all of these things together, we have to solve it as communities.
So speaking of keeping people in homes, and Alan, you can jump in at any point.
I know it's difficult when you're on the panel with 3 elected officials.
But you've got a stick.
So there's this one question here. Does rent control work, and is it being considered?
I didn't quite catch it.
Does rent control?
Pardon?
Does rent control work?
Does rent control work?
Yeah.
Well, obviously, if you're in a state that has made it illegal, it's not going to happen. So it becomes something of an intellectual exercise, unless, of course, you can convince the state legislature to the contrary. But I think rent control, it works and it doesn't work. It works in that it does keep rents down. There's no question. In that respect, it works. And it does benefit large numbers of lower income people. The question is, and this is what economists and people debate, are the side effects worse than the benefits? And the side effects are twofold. First, unless you structure it very carefully, it's going to benefit a lot of people who don't really need the benefit, which means there's a lot of waste going on. Secondly, and this is the big question mark, it discourages investment in both in upgrading and maintaining existing housing and building new housing. Now, how much, obviously there's huge debates on how much it does and how much it benefits people. And obviously when you say rent control, there are lots of different variations of rent control. So I think it's something that can be looked at. But again, it's not a panacea. Because one of the things, and this is a bit of a tangent, but we talk about the impacts of growth. The price increases, the insane increase in housing costs and rents in Seattle is not a product of growth in the sense of growth of population and growth of housing units. The upscale housing developments that are being built in downtown Seattle and around Lake Union are not driving the increased costs. If you didn't have, it's being driven by job growth and the influx of people who are making very high salaries on the housing market. If you didn't have the housing construction that Seattle is getting and that some of the suburbs around King County are getting, things would probably be even worse in terms of housing costs than they are. So you don't want to shut off, as long as you're having the kind of job growth and the kind of income growth and the influx of wealth into this community, you don't want to do things that will shut off or slow down the volume of construction that's taking place, even though it may make traffic in some areas a mess. Because that is not what's driving the problem. It may not be solving it, but it's certainly not driving it.
Any comments?
Well, in answer to the question of whether there's anything being done, I will say the cities in my district, I'm not at a city, but the cities in my district are focusing far more on the supply end than they are on the controlling and regulating end. And so they contribute into a joint fund for subsidized housing. We all have put quite a bit of government, millions and millions of government resources into preserving particular housing, supporting the King County Housing Authority. We put a lot of work into incentives. The multi-family property tax exemption incentive works. It's putting a fair number of units out into the market that are affordable. There are some ideas for tweaks to that might work. So if you've got a multi-family property that is coming up to the 12-year expiration of its temporary property tax exemption, and it's been held at 60% area median income affordability, well, maybe we could extend that for another 12 years and require deeper affordability, because now actually it's naturally become more affordable because, as you say, the owner is not putting a lot of upgrades into that building. It's still fine, but it's not the most expensive building around. So we've been working more on the incentive side and on the subsidizing side than on trying to regulate rents or housing costs.
And some of the organizations that do build the affordable housing get tax credits, and there are some expectations that their rents are kept at a certain level. And as far as affordable home ownership, which I have a real passion for, I will tell you one of the biggest problems that we have right now, unless it's in the city of Seattle where they're built, and maybe Bellevue where they're building $1 million, $2 million condominiums. The condominium laws are almost impossible. They're very affordable for entry-level home ownership, but no developer is building them because of the liability laws in the state of Washington. They are not going to do it because before they even get the building done, there is a lawsuit. There are liabilities in place, and so they'd prefer to build apartments. And it's great to have people with a roof over their head, but if we're going to help people up and out of the current situation, then we need to be doing things to help them, like be able to build equity in something that they own instead of lining the pockets of the person that owns the building that they live in. And so if we can get some affordable home ownership out there, I think it's that rising tide lifts all boats. So we need to work with our state legislators to ensure that we can change those condominium laws to ensure that developers are ready to build those condominiums.
And I think the other thing is, even if we can't do rent control because of the prohibition, that doesn't mean we can't do things to protect tenants. Yeah. And it doesn't mean we can't do things to subsidize rent. So, for example, we had a pilot program, which we're now going to continue and expand, to try to give rental subsidies and assistance to those people who are on the bubble that without it might fall into homelessness. So if we can grow those programs, we also have to have more tenant protections, particularly around evictions. I don't know how many people saw the recent report on evictions, but the impact of evictions on family, particularly women and women of color, is stunning. So we have to have ways to help people before they're evicted to bridge that gap. So I think there's a whole range of things we have to do around having protections for people, giving them subsistence, and making sure, again and again, housing, housing, housing. We just need more of it that's affordable.
Can
Yeah,
I add one thing on this? I'm sorry. You
No.
go.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's picking up a couple of points. I think the mayor's absolutely right. I mean, obviously, you can't do what you can't do, but you've got to do and really work hard to do what you can do. And I think we've got to increase the supply of affordable housing as much as possible. But you also have to work and maybe use subsidies or other incentives to try to keep housing that is in the private market and is affordable to the people who need it. And again, it may not be affordable to people at 30% of AMI, but it may be affordable at 60%, to keep that housing affordable, to provide tax incentives, other subsidies, and so forth. And I think eviction is one of the biggest issues that we have to confront. By the way, here's another statistic I just looked this up this morning. In Seattle, the average married couple with kids earns $161,000. The average single mom with kids earns $36,000. And for eviction is a lot less about gentrification. In fact, it's not really about gentrification. Am I saying there's never any eviction associated with gentrification? Of course not. But eviction is fundamentally about poverty. And it's about poverty, it's about the lack of recourse, and it's about the lack of legal representation. I know New York and I think Newark, New Jersey are now developing programs to make sure that tenants in eviction court have access to legal representation. That's going to make a big difference. But that's an issue that has to be confronted. Just like the other issue, and here I'll get up on my soapbox for a little bit, is the question of rental assistance. I mean, most of the low income, the very poor people below 30% of AMI in Seattle and King County who are not cost burdened, it's not because by some miracle they found an apartment that's renting for $400 a month. It's because they've received a housing voucher. And we do a very weird thing in this country. If we think of the basic necessities, when it comes to food, we have the SNAP program. It's not great, but anybody who meets the criteria gets the benefits. When it comes to health care, we have Medicaid. Again, it's not great, but anybody who meets the criteria gets the benefits. But when it comes to shelter and a roof over somebody's head, we approach it completely differently. We say, if you meet the criteria, you get a ticket to enter a lottery. And if you're lucky, and maybe depending on how you look at the numbers, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 of you will win the lottery, and the others, you're at risk of eviction, homelessness, doubling up, the whole thing. It's a choice. And again, the city of Seattle and King County can help deal with that, but it's likely to be at the margins. The only entity that can solve that problem once and for all is the federal government. And to me, when we talk about federal housing policy, or even perhaps federal urban policy, because evictions and homelessness reverberate for neighborhoods, for families, for children, and so forth, that I truly believe is probably the single most important thing that the federal government could do to address the needs of America's poor and the needs of America's neighborhoods, is to provide a across-the-board housing allowance to everybody who needed that to find decent shelter.
Even with the HUD funding that most of our cities receive, there are such restrictions on how we can spend that money. As Mayor Durkan said, sometimes somebody might just need $100 to help pay their rent. But if they don't have that $100, they get evicted. So then to try and get someone back into housing, it's first and last month's rent, and it's a security deposit, and then it's making sure that you can pay that rent. We have done such a disservice because that $100 turns into $5,000. And we can certainly afford a lot more $100 gifts or assistance than we can that 5,000. But there's another area where we need to have some of the laws changed so that people understand it's not that we don't want to give that money. There are restrictions on it, and we would love to be able to do that. You know, Auburn used to be called the little Detroit of the West, so I always use a car analogy of it's preventive maintenance on your car. If you put in good gas and you change the spark plugs, your car is going to continue to drive for a long time. If you don't do those things, your engine seizes up, and then it's a whole lot more expensive to change the engine to keep that car going. So a little bit of preventive maintenance goes a long ways.
I was just thinking it would be wrong for me to talk about eviction from public housing like the White House that I'm in favor of. Someone I'd like to evict from that house.
I will, at this point, go ahead and ask our final question. And these questions have really been great in driving this conversation, and we appreciate them. What are you, as leaders within institutions steeped in racism, what are you doing to examine your own practices to ensure that the well-designed system that currently best serves affluent whites is dismantled, and we are rebuilding a city that is equitable for all, or a county that is equitable for all?
Yeah. It's got to start with us. And of course, the city of Seattle, before I got there, had its own initiatives on racial equity. And the very first executive order I signed was to double down on that. And for example, in the first, I think it was month or month and a half we're there, the whole mayor's office, myself included, spent a day in unconscious bias training. And we are requiring that of all my department leaders. And in every decision we make, we have to filter it through a racial equity lens on what's going to be the impacts here. But that's formulaic in some ways. What you find when you go through these trainings, and you know it is, imperceptibly every day, every single one of us filters everything we see through our own experiences. And if you are a person who's had the privileges you've had in life, those filters come in very different ways. And if we don't put that at the center of what we do and acknowledge it in the small ways and the big ways, we will only perpetuate systemic racism and other inequities. And so we have to be willing to check ourselves on it, but also to continually ask those same questions, have the trainings, go into community, let people tell you that you're not being true to it. And make sure you go to those places where it is the hardest to go and have the hardest conversations, because otherwise you just fall right into what's easy. And what's easy won't change what's systemically wrong with our country.
I don't know if I can say anything that would be better than what Mayor Durkan said, other than just to let you know that the smaller cities are doing some of those same things. We are working with a trainer to do implicit bias training for all 480 of our employees, and that includes the directors, that includes those that are doing maintenance and operations in our parks, in the mayor's office. Everyone is going to go through that training so that we do start to look at things a little differently, right? So that when someone comes to the counter to pay their utility bill, we don't have a preconceived idea of what they're going to say or how they're going to react, and we're checking our own biases. I mean, we all, if we're honest about it, we all have our biases, because it does come from a place of our own experience. What we need to do is better understand the experiences of those that don't look like us, don't live where we live, and don't have the jobs that we have.
And then it's systemic. One last thing is, it hits in so many ways. Like when I came in mayor, we looked at one thing that seemed like it's so obvious that someone should have done it. We vacated all the marijuana convictions that, marijuana is legal now, yet people have those convictions on their record, and they're disproportionately men of color. So why do we allow that to continue? And so you ask the question, and we're able to vacate all those convictions. So if you look system by system and cause by cause, there are things we can do to unwind previous, discrimination, but we have to always be checking ourselves.
Community court is another way. We're looking at working with King County to have community court, to where the first the first decision is not to convict someone, but to offer different services and defer sentencing as long as you can provide services for them and opportunities for them to move up and out of that situation. They are not defined simply by that act that got them arrested.
The question was personal. The question was personal. What are we doing? I'm going to say a few words about the institution at King County. King County did some of the groundbreaking work on looking at health indicators and indicators of success geographically and by race throughout King County a few years ago. Came out with those maps that lit up in red that Mayor Backus was talking about, and what they showed was that across every social indicator you could think of, the outcomes were poorer among communities of color, immigrant communities, disadvantaged communities. And so that started a real change at King County where and this is before my time as an elected official there, we adopted a Equity and Social Justice Initiative. It's gradually staffed up. A lot of it is internal looking at the county legislature, and throughout King County we do go through implicit bias training. We do check our policies. We do apply a racial and equity lens to the decisions that we make. We do try to talk about it a lot. We do try, when we do things like the Regional Affordable Housing Task Force work, to go out into the community, not just have all our meetings in downtown Seattle. We try to have meetings where all we do is listen, and we talk to communities that are affected, and we hear from them, and we take their input into account. We don't do as well as we could at engagement. We do fairly well at outreach, but engagement in terms of sort of then working back and forth to create solutions together. I will say that over the last couple of years working as a legislator at King County, I've really personally, to answer the question directly, made an attempt to try to step outside and view my own biases and my own privilege as I'm making decisions. For example, earlier today, I was on a panel at a conference about the future of transportation, automation and such, and it's really great shiny stuff. I mean, there are ways in which our transportation system is starting to transform that will make things very, very convenient. And so I had to stop for a second. Everybody's getting very excited about this idea. The businesses are going to get rich, and people are going to hop into science fiction movie cars that will just whisk you off to wherever. And I thought, yeah, but is that going to happen everywhere? Is that going to happen? Is it probably going to happen in Bellevue somewhere? Is it going to happen in my neighborhood where more middle-class people live? Is it going to happen And so what does it mean to think about innovation in transportation and how that rolls out equitably? How do we not create the new R.H. Thompson freeway? How do we not create the 21st century version of transportation that split communities, that destroyed communities of color and longstanding communities? Because we'll do it. We'll do it again if we're not thoughtful. So now that we're at the beginning of this planning for the next generation of investments, let's make sure we think about and include people to know that we're not going to make those same mistakes again. And that kind of thinking just has to become a discipline that we apply it over every single thing that we do, even if it doesn't seem obvious to us.
Oh, thank you. It has become that time. I wish we could stay here till midnight. There's a whole lot more great questions here, and actually I think we'll take those, and we will try to work with the staff of the various electeds here and the HDC folks and provide some answers to those questions working with Town Hall, because you've come up with some great questions. Please join me, first of all, in thanking Patience and our panel and Mr. Mallach. I heard the one question earlier from the audience, and I see it in the paper about the sense of urgency. And I believe that we're all struggling with this issue, and I know from experience that when we have a natural disaster, we tend to respond, hopefully, more quickly, because for one reason, we don't means test the people who are impacted. Disasters tend to happen universally to many people, although in some of them I've been involved in, disproportionate people of color are impacted because of where they're located. But the bottom line is that we need to help each other, not just our electeds, figure out how do we embrace that sense of urgency, how do we shed that means testing that keeps separating us, and how do we overcome the convenient and authentic ignorance that is causing us to be a divided region. So next time we gather, let's talk more about we're gathering some momentum as a unified region. Thank you all for coming.